Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors and improvers in supply chain management today, brought to you by AI Group.
Hello, I'm James Scotland, coming to you today from the Yunganbar country, and thank you for joining me for this very first episode of Supply Circles for 2024. This is the business improvement podcast that asks the question, how can we in Australia create supply chains that are resilient and sustainable at a time when we are implementing the challenges of the 3Ds. You know them: digitalisation to keep up with your peer and your industries, decarbonisation to meet your legal requirements and targets by 2050, and in some states even 2045 or earlier, and ongoing disruptions, which come in many shapes, including industry disruptions, product disruptions, logistical interruptions and challenges, technology change, global inflation, generational change, worldwide pandemics, and so many more. Each fortnight, I delve into different sections of the end-to-end supply chain. I chat with fascinating and interesting people, and we try to have some fun along the way. You know, back in the day when I was running businesses, I would always try and connect with an economist at least twice a year and seek out their advice on the broad view of the economy to get their insights into emerging trends. What should I be aware of? And this information greatly assisted me and my teams in planning my operations, my resource allocation, my sales team, and in setting targets and plans. It was critical information because often we are focused on our internal operations and forget to look outside the window. So I'm pleased to say for this very first episode of the year, I'm joined by a special guest and my colleague, Dr. Jeff Wilson, the Director of Research and Economics at the Australian Industry Group. I'm keen to get his thoughts and insights into what we've learnt from last year and what the new year might provide in terms of challenges and opportunities. So hello, Jeff. Welcome to the show and welcome to 2024.
Oh, thanks for having me on, James. I should probably, though, apologise on behalf of economists if you were only willing to speak to one of us twice a year, right? I think I would like to get that to twice a month. As some listeners would know, we're doing a lot of work at AI Group to get that ratio of economists to industry discussion going up a bit higher than that. But thanks for letting us in twice a year, mate. That's really nice.
I stand corrected. And I think that's right. You get the information regularly, but at least twice a year you've got to sit down and have a coffee and say, we'll just go a bit deeper. And that reminds me, a couple of episodes ago, I spoke to my good mate, Michael Kilgariff, who talked to us about infrastructure in Australia. And Michael trained as an economist. And he told me once of a number of economic theories, including my favourite, which is the dead cat bounce. And I said to him, as a marketer, if economists want to have a better rep, they need to come up with really good terms like the dead cat bounce. Do you know that one? Do you know that sort of stuff?
Yeah. It is a field that requires a marketing makeover. I think that would be pretty understood. Certainly, it is an important discussion. And this is partially what we have been trying to do with the economic research and economics team at AI Group, is actually start thinking about how do we get that, the different languages and the different cultures between economists and industry. How can we get that coming together? Because what we're trying to analyse and study is key for operation and investment decision making in industry. So really, getting that discussion happening is between the research and the decision makers has been my life's work. So thanks for having me on, and hopefully we can have a go for the outlook for 2024.
Well, let me introduce you to the listeners. Jeff Wilson is the Director of Research and Economics at AI Group. He is a very well-known and respected economist. He is a published academic and researcher. He has had a long career in international economic policy with a particular focus on how trade and investment shape the Australian industry and business environment. He has contributed to Commonwealth and state economic strategy developments. It's the first episode of the year. I'll get my mouth right soon. And he's worked with Indo-Pacific partners as well, as he's worked with industry development programs in the critical minerals, batteries and defence sector. And most recently, he and his team have put together a report titled The Australian Industry Outlook, which is based on the stated expectations for 2024 by over 300 of Australian CEOs. We'll get to that report shortly, but to just frame it, what's the report all about, Jeff, and why did you do it?
So AI Group have been doing a survey. It's sometimes called the CEO survey, but it's really a survey of business leaders. So CEOs, managing directors, people in the C-suite from Australian industry for over a decade now. So this is actually the 11th year we've been doing this. And what we do is we
Wow.
do this survey across all of our industry sectors: manufacturing, construction, engineering, all the technical and services, supply chain, warehouse transport, the whole lot. So industrial ecosystem of Australia. We go to the C-suite guys and we say, what was last year like for you? So can you tell us what your experience of 2023 was? And what are you thinking in terms of like what are you expecting for 2024? And what are you doing in your business to get ready for the coming year? So what's your growth strategy going to look like? Where are you investing in? What are you doing around workforce over the next 12 months? And so the idea is to really get a sense where Australian industry leaders, like how they feel and their sentiments about the year ahead and some of the decisions they're making, really to help everyone understand that. Because in the industrial ecosystem, I don't know, to sell supply circles, it's a supply chain, right? Like what's, the feelings and the sentiments that further up or down is what's affecting your demand or your supply. So, this is the purpose of the survey that we've now done it for 11 years. And the useful thing is we can actually put to this year in the context of the past as well. So we can say, well, we can compare to this as like it was during the mining boom, or this is like it was during pre-COVID, post-COVID, all of that stuff. So it's been really valuable. We had 300 industry leaders respond to the survey for us this year. And the businesses those people lead account for about 1% of the Australian economy. So we've actually got 1% of total Australian economy in this data here. So we think it's a really good resource. And it should be helpful for everyone to kind of understand what's going to be happening in that industrial ecosystem, how that can affect your business, and how you might need to think about your strategy over the next 12 months in light of what your peers and partners are doing.
Well, it's a significant piece of work then, 1%, but also with 11 years of context to refer to. That's fantastic. And I like the idea of being a C-suite assessment rather than just a CEO, picking up all the different parts of the economy by asking the leaders in each part of it. Good on you. We'll come back to that in a sec, but why don't we draw a line under 2023? What did you learn in 2023? It was a busy year for economists. There was a lot going on. Some of the things that popped into my mind is the geopolitics was pretty complicated with Ukraine and Russia, and then late in the year, Israel, China, and Taiwan kept being an issue. We had global inflation. We had the rise of AI in some parts. There's a lot going on. What did we? Also the IRA in America, the Inflation Reduction Act. There was just a lot happening. Well, draw a line under it. What did you learn as a head of research?
Look, we'd always thought life became very hard for not just economists, but any of us who are trying to understand how the industrial ecosystem's working. People having to do forecasts. What am I doing next year? The pandemic was really hard for us because all your normal rules of thinking, sales are going to go up by 10% or 5%. You could increment stuff based on past experience. Completely went out the window during the pandemic. This is this once in a generation disaster. Everything was quite strange. The level of volatility and unexpectedness we kind of got used to during that period. And I think after we got out of that, 2022, but definitely 2023 was a solid, completely post-pandemic year, right? I think a lot of people think it would go back to normal. And one of the things that was really hard for us, I think, was some of those geopolitical challenges, which had that black swan element. Like it wasn't the pandemic, but again, no amount of work. Someone, for example, like some of the stuff that's going on right now as we speak in the Red Sea with, shipping not getting through the Red Sea properly at the moment. There's no economist or product manager or logistician in the world who's going to be able to predict that in their plans for 2024.
Put the best strategic planners into a meeting and you couldn't possibly scenario plan some of those things from last year.
Yeah. And so I think we thought that stuff happens that you can't scenario plan was a COVID thing. And we're now going back into things where you can foresee. We had that with ongoing issues around energy markets and Russia. We've seen that in the Red Sea issues. There's been a number of other geopolitical problems going on. Just the last couple of over the weekend, Taiwan's had an election, and that's led to some pretty escalatory talk from the Chinese government about that as well. That hasn't affected industry yet, but it could very quickly. I think that the lesson I take out of 2023 is don't think unplannable was just a pandemic thing and we're back into the world of, oh, well, there's risk, but you can plan for them like that, that you could be hit by a black swan is going to be a fact of life. It might be a pandemic black swan. It might be a geopolitical black swan. It might be an economic black swan, but we're living in the age of black swans, I think would be my lesson for 2023. And, we suspect, and we certainly see in our survey business leaders this year that that's what they say. The number one thing they're going is uncertainty. The number one response was uncertainty.
The new normal is not normal. Yeah. We can't go back. Yeah.
No, it's abnormal is normal is the point. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. We'll work out that saying, but there's somewhere in there about the new normal is abnormal. Yeah. Some of the things that we expected to see accelerate didn't. We expected, I guess, a greater focus on onshoring, on sovereign capability, of circular economy, of the rise of electric vehicles a lot faster than they did. What were you surprised didn't happen, and why?
Something that we did see happen that was positive, I think, is and I mean this is topical in supply circles, is a lot of the supply chain challenges that we'd seen during the pandemic and they continued actually did start to resolve in 2023. So we see global shipping costs come back down. There's always little things about particular products and particular ports, but generally those headline indicators came back down to the normal levels that you'd normally expect them to.
There was a little bit of overcapacity in the shipping, in the container shipping industry.
There was, because people had put a lot on during that time, so they kind of overshot a little bit. But we got back to normal shipping costs, relatively normal for a lot of those things. And to some, at least insofar as supply chain physical shortages went. If we'd had this conversation last year, and I think we did at one point, we were talking about people weren't able to, they were concerned about the access in the supply chain. So we can't, I've got to wait 9 months for something that used to take 9 weeks. I've had to build up a huge inventory, fill the warehouses because we need all this just in case stock in place because of that. Well, we have seen a lot of that ended. The bit of the supply chain that hasn't fixed itself.
Well, sorry, what have we seen? We've seen that calm down, have we? The people aren't building their inventories as much as we were expecting out of COVID.
No, inventories have been run down, and certainly what we saw in our survey of industry leaders this year was that most industry leaders said, well, we're not building inventories anymore. Okay. We're actually going to let them run down. We're going to have more of a cost efficiency focus. So, we had a just in case. Last year, we have gone back to a kind of just-in-time philosophy.
Wow.
For supply chain. A lot of that's driven to cost because while the availability's fixed itself, cost still hasn't. We've still got very high rates of inflation in Australia. They were, for CPI inflation was 8% last Christmas. It's kind of come down into the 6-ish. But it's a long way to go. That's still a long way to go. It's gone from being disastrous to just terrible. And we're looking, certainly in Australia, another 2 years before inflation is going to get back to what we'd consider kind of normal price stability levels. So while the supply chain availability issue has healed itself, the supply chain cost issue certainly hasn't yet. And we see a lot of businesses and industry leaders are saying, okay, so that's getting us to rethink about how we can go back to supply chain basics. Just in time, how can we drive process efficiency? How we thinking hard about the inventory you're holding, thinking hard about purchasing against sales strategy as well. All those questions are they're bread and butter supply chain issues for professionals in the field, but they've come right back to the top of the list in this high cost environment.
Yeah, it does mean that we've gone back to risk management of our margins rather than risk management of the weak points in our supply chains. And that was exposed in COVID. Interesting strategies. What about onshoring, and what about looking to local suppliers rather than overseas suppliers? Did we see that happen? Because last time we spoke, you said that actually hadn't really happened. We'd gone to nearshoring rather than onshoring.
Yeah, certainly. What we've seen in our data. So we asked the industry leaders in Australia about this. What are you doing about your supply chain? The top answers that we got from close to nearly half businesses were things like, we're going to focus on our operational practices. So a lot of that, back nuts and bolts, good supply chain management stuff. A lot of them are also thinking about renegotiating their supply contracts as well. So really thinking about, if we're buying more, could we get a better price? It's the commercial side of good supply chain management. But we have seen that onshoring or nearshoring thing come down. And in fact, sourcing new overseas supplies is the lowest ranked supply chain strategy. Only 1 in 8 Australian companies say that they're going to be trying to find new overseas suppliers, and the same number say that they're going to be looking to some local or in-house production.
Okay.
And that reflects the fact that cost is now the principal. We've got this really big lingering inflation problem. How do we manage that? And we're going to be, that's not to say companies wouldn't insource if it's cost effective, but for most, they're saying this isn't about security of supply, it's about cost effectiveness of supply, and we're willing to consider all options as long as we can try and manage that stuff on the cost side.
Let's talk about inflation, because it keeps coming up. It was the big issue of last year, I would suggest. Now, my understanding of inflation is that it is the rate of price increase. When we talk about inflation being at 6%, that's the rate of the price increase. The bit that gets talked about in vague terms, but not specifically, is if it was costing me $1 and inflation is 6%, it's now $1.06. If it then comes down to 3% inflation, it's now costing me $1.09 or something or other. But it's still costing me more than what it was before inflation. The costs aren't coming down just because inflation is coming down. Is that right? And how do we as business people try and manage that?
Yeah, when people say prices are coming down, they mean disinflation. So it would be like -3 or -6 rather than 6, right? That's extremely rare. Generally, economists would look at this stuff and we see prices tend to work on a ratchet basis. They go up, but they don't go back down. Part of the reason for that is the price of any particular object is actually caught up in a whole set of supply chains where the price of something, the price of a car is a function of the price of the components that go into it. And then there's other stuff that come off the price of a car, like the price of getting an Uber or something, or buying a taxi or transporting goods.
So the price of steel for the car impacts on the price of the car, but also the price of transporting that car from Japan to Australia, for example, that impacts on the price of the car. And then as we said before, the price of holding that stock until we can sell it is inflationary as well. So there's this sort of like multiple inflationary aspect. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and all of that kind of through the supply chain stacks up. So, a small thing can be a little bit like Chinese whispers through a system, right? Like as it goes through those layers, everything goes up and up and up. It's very hard to come back down. Look, in a country like Australia, we would consider inflation is a little bit inevitable. We consider what we call price stability. About 2 to 3% would be where you would consider kind of inflation that was normal or acceptable. In fact, if it's too low, the one way you get rid of inflation, you can stop it by having a recession. So generally, as economists, we do like a little bit of it because it tells you your economy is growing. If you've got negative inflation, that's bad news for your economy. But you only want, that's where, say, the RBA and a lot of people would think that should be about. We've been hugely over that, and we're going to be over that in this country for the next 2 years by all the current forecasts. So it's going to be Christmas 2025 before we're back to comfort levels in terms of that inflation. And the question therefore is, well, what can companies do to manage that? Because that's a known factor now. How can business leaders think, am I going to build that into my business plan? What can I do to bring it down? Can I pass costs on through the supply chain? Do I try and negotiate down? Can I drive efficiencies that take my bit of cost out of the structure? That's the really big question business leaders in lots of different ways, depending on their industry, right? But they're all thinking about that right now.
Yeah. You said being in Australia, we have to deal with a certain amount of inflation. What's the inflation like around the world and how's that impacting us?
Well, this is an interesting one where inflation was kind of working in Australia's favour during the pandemic, but it looks like it's going to be against our competitive favour next year. So during the pandemic, particularly 2022, Australia had some of the best, like we had bad inflation, but it was relatively less worse than other countries around the world. So we had some of the lowest inflation in the OECD, even when it was 8%. The reason for that was at that time, a lot of the inflation was being driven by primary products. So energy, particularly the Russia-Ukraine war, and global food prices during the pandemic. There had been some droughts, food demand, some supply chain snarls around the food supply. And Australia produces food and energy, so we were relatively better off than all our competitors. So 12 months ago, we could have said inflation's bad in Australia, but it's relatively good. It's a competitive advantage for us because ours is lower. That story's flipped as energy and food have come back out. And now we're seeing a lot of challenges around like management of the economy and a tight labour market, cost structure like that. Australia's going to have some of the highest inflation of the developed world in 2024. So we've gone from being bottom of the pack to top of the pack, even as it comes down. And that is going to have an impact on our relative industrial competitiveness. Because if you're competing, very often Australian businesses won't typically compete with what wouldn't be in manufacturing, for example, competing with Chinese companies. They're in different products and different niches. But if you look to the United States, like inflation's still got a still at 6 level. It's already below 3 in the US. So your US competitors are actually back to normal prices already, while we've got 2 more years to wait till we get rid of this inflation cost escalation problem. And that's going to mean where we compete in high value niches with other developed countries, Europe, America, Japan, Korea kind of competitors. This is going to be a relative competitive millstone for Australia over 2024. Yeah.
Perhaps that's why the CEOs are saying they're looking to source overseas. It's the prices overseas are better. Even though we're going to reduce our inventory, which is a bit of a risk, at least the prices are pretty attractive from what you're saying in terms of inflationary pressure.
Yeah.
Just to finish up on before we get to the CEO's report, what are the economic trends that you're seeing? What are the big macro trends that you're seeing that we should be aware of?
Well, so what we see if we're for the look out to 2024 is some of those problems that industry kind of had to deal with during the pandemic and the post-pandemic wash-up period, particularly things around inflationary problems and also the labour shortages in general, skills shortages specifically, and also that has wage costs associated with it, whether you're having to pay more to get staff, retain staff, or you have to pay them to do overtime. But on the other hand, during the last period of the pandemic, demand was at least buoyant. So your costs were going up, your labour pressure was going up, but markets were going, sales were going great guns. And so you kind of had a supply side problem, but a demand side good times, and that they cancelled each other out.
It's more of a margin problem, just trying to manage your margin through all of that, yeah.
It does become a margin juggle, and some businesses came out ahead, some businesses didn't come out ahead on that. But there was one side was going up, the other side was going down. You could jiggle the scales, right? The problem we've got when we look at 2024 is the Australian economy, because of inflation, because of the very high interest rates that the Reserve Banks had to jack up interest rates to try and fight that back down, and that inhibits consumer spending, it inhibits business investment, it slows the economy. That slowed the economy right down, and the Australian economy's growth is going to be mediocre would be the generous term for it. If you're looking at 2024, forecasters are saying about 1.3% economic growth next year, which isn't a recession, but Australia's long run is 2.7, so it's less than half of what we're used to in this country over the last 10 years. And in per capita terms, it is a per cap because our population growth is higher than that. So from an individual's point of view, it will feel like a recession because the economy is growing slower than population growth. So that's what that's going to mean for a lot of businesses in industry is all of those supply problems, labour shortage, inflation, the supply side problem stays the same, but the demand side, which was holding the thing up, is also looking on the negatives. So you've got negatives on both sides of the scales in 2024. And this is why those problems are going to become harder to solve, because you're not just going to be able to expect more sales, which is going to cover up the fact that your margins are getting weaker, or we can increase sales by 10% and kind of wear a bit of margin loss. You're not going to be that. It's unlikely on mass that industry is going to be able to do that, which is why the focus has to come back on those kind of classic cost control, efficiency, productivity measures, that we came to know and love during the 1990s.
Yeah, I know when I was running the demand side of businesses, the economists would always say the economy is a perception. And if the general public feel like it's not good, their spending is not good, we all save more. And then we've got a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. It feels bad, so it becomes bad. Sounds like you're painting that same picture of the 90s.
No, and consumer sentiment in Australia, I don't think anyone will need convincing of this point. Consumer sentiment's very weak. House prices are very high. Inflation's bad. There's a lot of bad news in the world as well, which consumers are really sensitive to as well. And that's so we're going to have the supply side problem will persist. The demand side problem, the demand side benefit will evaporate. What do we do? That's effectively the question. That looks different in different kinds of industries, like manufacturing, construction. There's lots of different ways that question plays out, but that's what the entire industrial ecosystem has in common this year.
Yeah. No, nicely put. We'll get to the report in just a moment. One last question before we do. Whenever I talk to people, which is regularly, obviously, there seems to be some confusion as to whether or not there is a skill shortage or a staff shortage. Everyone seems to have a different view of this. What's your view looking at the data?
Both. So skills shortages in Australia are very common. And this is partly because we're a small, advanced economy, with only a relatively small workforce, lots of stuff. There's always lots of technological change that gets implemented here relatively quickly. You could see something around AI. We might want to talk about this a bit later. Like, it's a new technology. Everyone's going to have a skills shortage on AI when you start because it's a new technology. No one knows how to use it. Just like, for those who are old enough to remember, there were skills shortages around using computers back in the 1980s, remember, because suddenly they came into industry. Very few people have been trained on them. That's a natural thing. But there is, what we've seen is actually what we would consider aggregate labour shortage in Australia. So not just a shortage of skilled workers, but a shortage of workers, full stop. We have a very large number of job vacancies in Australia, probably almost double the number of job vacancies that we'd normally have, plus 400,000, depending on, and quite high job vacancy rate. Got very, very low unemployment. And we've also got very, very high labour force participation rates. So practically everyone who can work is working. And we've seen over the last 2 years a big push for a lot of different people that previously hadn't been engaged with the labour market, particularly women who have now come into the labour market as a kind of reserve army of labour. But that hits a limit. And effectively, we are working the Australian labour force that we've got as hard as we can. And there's still unmet demand for labour. That does make the skills shortage problem worse. So you feel your skills shortage pinch worse at a time when there's general labour shortages. But we do have both at the moment. And that means it's something that's not just affecting those classic specialist roles. Australia's been short of cybersecurity professionals forever. Lots of other technical roles in industries that we're permanently kind of always trying to get. You are seeing shortages for unskilled roles in Australia as well, and we have been for 12 months. And the forecasts are that will continue through 2024 as well.
Tell me, my friend, do we have a shortage of economists?
We do. In fact, we do. The number of Australians being trained in economics has halved over the last decade. And we desperately need more economists as well, particularly, I'm sorry to say, James, female economists. What? It is one of the few areas in Australia, I'm very sad to say this is my profession, where the number of women doing economics at uni as a share has actually gone backwards. It's becoming more male-dominated. Now, it's economics training today is more male-dominated than when I went through 20 years ago. Wow. And that's actually scandalous, in my view, that the mix is going in the wrong direction. There's something seriously wrong there.
Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that. But let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the C-suite assessment.
If you have supply chain or business improvement challenges, contact AI Group's Business Improvement and Growth Hub. The Big Hub is a library of practical and relevant resources designed to assist member businesses to grow and improve. The Big Hub also includes an extensive network of experienced pre-qualified business improvement consultants. For more details, contact big@aigroup.com.au. That's big@aigroup.com.au.
I'm talking to my friend and colleague, Dr. Jeff Wilson, the head of research and economics at Australian Industry Group. And Jeff, before the break, I mentioned we're going to talk about the Australian Industrial Outlook 2024 report. Is it a new name? Doesn't sound like the one from last year.
Yeah, no. Look, we did do a bit of a marketing makeover this year, but what we thought, that this is a really interesting survey because at AI Group, we're an industry body. We represent straight the industrial ecosystem, and that's who we have in this survey. So this is 300 C-suite leaders, CEOs, MDs, operational managers of those, CFOs, but out of Australian industrial businesses, manufacturing, construction, engineering, supply chain, transport, utilities, that kind of stuff. And so what we really wanted to do was present this is the industry outlook from those industry sectors. So it's what Australia's industrial ecosystem is saying about the industrial ecosystem for the future year. And there should be some truth in advertising, so we made the name Richard.
Very good. And let's put some markers down. When's it being released and how's it going to be promoted? I think there's a webinar, which will be a lot easier to look at than trying to talk about economic issues in a podcast.
Economics does lend itself to visual elements, so it's quite hard for me doing this just verbally. So we'll be out. It's just been released on January the 22nd, but we'll be having a webinar for anyone in industry. It does include our members, but you don't have to be an AI group member to come along. Where we're going to be talking about the survey, having some findings and asking some questions from some industry leaders that we're going to get together and actually have a bit of a collective discussion about that. That'll be on the 8th of February at 11 o'clock in the morning if you're in a daylight savings Eastern State.
And head over
whatever your time is.
Head over to aigroup.com.au to get the details of that webinar. Jeff, you mentioned that one of the sections you look at is investment, what CEOs or C-suite executives are thinking about in terms of investment. And we were talking about AI and digitalisation, a key part of this podcast. Tell me about that.
So every year we take a measure of like what businesses' investment intentions are. So firstly, how much investment you're planning to do next year in your business, what you're going to invest in, so what you're thinking about investing in, and why. What are the factors that are leading you to do that? And what we've done this year is that a lot of the investment intentions have been pulled back because of uncertainty, rising costs, slowing demand. We have something that's called a net score, so a positive or negative score, and we've got relatively low scores for R&D spending and capex, but old school classic capex, buildings and machinery for next year. We have a very high score, however, for technology spending, and indeed half of business leaders say that they're going to increase their technology spend in 2024, and very few are saying that they're going to cut it back. So what we can see in this is a kind of reorientation towards looking towards various forms of technology spending to try and address some of those problems you've got around costs and other issues. When we ask businesses,
particularly staff shortages as well. Staff shortages and skill shortages might be solved by technology.
Could be labour cost, could be supply chain cost, yeah. And so what we then said to ask that we've got another question in our survey where we said businesses, well, what are you trying to achieve with these investments? So what are your priorities to achieve? The number one thing people said they wanted from their investments was business process improvement. That was the top issue. We want to see our investment make our business work more efficiently and productively. And that's why you see things like technology. Staff training was also ranked very highly. So classic CAPEX, not a priority. Staff training and technology, very high priorities.
Good to see the supply chain managers are winning the arguments. Give us some money to improve our efficiency.
And so what we see is when you see that focus, it becomes very clear because they're saying we want business process improvement, we want staff training. They also want a lot of investment in ICT, both, and this is importantly, both cybersecurity related ICT. I'm sure you guys have talked about cyber in the supply chain and the horrendous risk that could be if that multiplied through, but also your classic ICT investments. How can we digitize the enterprise to manage cost better, to possibly do some automation, particularly in the context of staff shortages and high labour costs? And so this is really a back to basics. We're not pulling back. We're still going to invest. So it's not a recession, but we're really thinking about back to basics, how can we make our businesses run more efficiently, more productively, and direct our investment not so much to the growth side. So we're not really thinking about how do we grow this business. We're thinking about how do we make this business ready and for a slowing economy with cost pressures and probably a lot more competition that we're going to face over the next 12 months too.
Fascinating. One of the things that we learned during COVID was that the companies that were set up digitally were able to adapt quicker, were able to respond faster because they had the data at their fingertips. Do you think you get a feeling that we're setting up for adaptive enterprises, or are we going back to old school and locking down into the way we've always done it?
There's a big challenge, and this is a kind of industrial digitization question. There's a big challenge here when we think about cybersecurity. Because on one hand, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people on this would be involved in Internet of Things, IoT for industry, and what that looks like in the industrial context in Australia. And there is this tension here between it, because on one hand, having the digital factory or the digital supply chain, it lets you do much more with your ERP system, right? Like it becomes a lot smarter, becomes a lot more connected. You can do a lot more stuff in terms of efficiency, cost saving, productivity, the more that you digitize. The downside is there's also a cyber risk to that, because once you do that, it goes on the internet and IoT devices become an exposure point. Whereas if it's dumb stuff in the factory, it's not smart stuff, it's dumb stuff. Hackers can't hack into dumb stuff. We have seen, and this is why this year in our survey, we actually asked business leaders, like, could you tell us about your tech investments? Are they cyber related or general? And we actually found that the number one thing was cyber. So there's definitely an awareness of that trade-off. But equally, that does have to happen, because otherwise, in a high-cost environment, if we don't do that digitization, so you can do automation and you can do proper workflow, process flow management of whatever your industry's process is, you're really going to struggle to manage costs or be competitive.
In the report, there was a lot of supply chain questions. Is there anything we haven't covered in supply chain? Anything we should be talking about? We talked about inventory for a start. We talked about looking for new suppliers and looking locally. Anything else in that report?
We do have a number of companies that have actually told us, because of the supply chain issues, that they're looking to change their market offering as well. So in the survey, about 21% of businesses said supply chain issues are such that we're thinking about what our market offering is.
Wow, okay.
That might mean there are products that you're taking to market. You're like, the margin on inflation of the input cost have destroyed the margin on this. We're not going to do that anymore because the margin's not there. You have seen that in some areas in Australia with high energy prices, where some companies are saying we're not doing that anymore because the margin's just not there for that product. It could also mean moving into new things as well, though, where we can see supply chain opening opportunities where we might have competitiveness, particularly in Australia. Yeah.
It's a rapidly changing world. Surely businesses have to be looking for whether or not their product is still going to be relevant in 2 years' time. And that sounds like they are.
So it can be upside and downside. But it's really interesting to me that 1 in 5 Australian industrial leaders say we're thinking about supply chain and structuring our market offering. Usually you would go to the market, work out, we think there's demand for product X, Y, or Z, and then you would build a supply chain to meet market demand. But this is an example where it's actually the cart and horse the other way around. We're saying supply chain is so important, we're thinking about what we're going to take to the market based on that. And 1 in 5 tell us in this survey that they're actually thinking in that terms, which from a supply chain management point of view is excellent. I mean, supply chain managers rejoice here. If you are one, we love you. But also really shows that while those shortage issues we talked about, like you just can't get the stuff in, have abated, that doesn't mean supply chain is over. It's now a cost issue, and it's now how does that structure the whole business's structure the cost and margin? What does that mean for our market strategy, our products? Supply chain is still driving industry, just from a cost point of view rather than availability point of view.
Yeah, it's a great insight, and I look forward to seeing the webinar and having a look at the charts to make your life a bit easier. We should finish up. It's been a great chat. Before we do, just putting on your economics hat rather than your research hat, we're recording this in January in Australia, so naturally there are natural disasters all over the place, and that affects business and industry. What's happening? Is our economy going to be affected in the next few months because of what's been going on weather-wise in Australia, or have we come through it pretty well? Have you got any sense of where we're at?
I'm really reluctant for those, particularly if we are in mid-January when we're recording here, everybody, and James, I'm almost terrified. I'll say it's been okay, and I'll jinx it for the country. There has been. I'm WA based. It's been 38 degrees here for the last week, and there's been fires of house losses every day here in Perth. So I'm really sensitive about saying it hasn't been as bad as some might have expected at this point in the year. But at least from an industry point of view, that is true. I mean, big floods, Queensland as well, up where you are, but we haven't gotten where we were 2 years ago when a lot of roads were cut, particularly Melbourne to Adelaide, and that was causing. Just the luck of the draw means the natural challenges this January haven't been in locations that got in the way of industry in the way that they did last year, right? There, for the grace of God, go we. And may this still be true in 6 weeks' time? Yeah.
Is the economy strong enough at the moment to handle these kind of intense pressures, or are we in a fragile situation?
I think the Australian economy is probably able to handle that, particularly where these things in Australia often affect agricultural supply chains, which aren't critical to the national economy so much. I'm not sure the global economy is, however, and there when we're talking about natural disasters, they're more man-made than they're exogenous, but they're more man-made. There is a lot of geopolitical risk queued up, right? Situation currently in the Red Sea, Israel-Hamas war, Ukraine-Russia, China with respect to Taiwan after Taiwan's just had an election, elected a pro-independence president, which has very much upset the People's Republic of China.
Election year in the US, which affects the whole world, as everyone says, what's going on over there.
Just today, as we're recording, Trump won the Iowa caucus, and he's known to hate trade and wants to blow global trade system up.
Yeah. So it affects everyone. Yeah.
There's a lot of different risks. I mean, we can't. I don't think it's our job to say which ones of these are going to happen or not happen. But I would stress that the number of these little things that kind of queued up, probably most of them won't spill over into a disaster. But there is a lot of things on the precipice geopolitically at the moment. And sometimes one causes another one, right? We'd be very, very concerned about that and probably need to think systematically. Like this does mean risk is not gone. There could be things that end up looking like the pandemic for more man-made reasons coming in the next 12 months. And so we would just say, like, I mean, go and get some tarot cards out if you want to pick which one of those it might be. Yeah. But businesses are going to need to be thinking about resilience for what if in those circumstances. And a lot of the lessons we learned during the pandemic about how you keep things going when suddenly certain things you used to just get cut off overnight. How do we rebuild a business to keep functioning around that in 6 weeks? A lot of those lessons for different problems are probably going to be pertinent over the next couple of years. So don't forget the pandemic just yet.
Yeah. This has been a great chat, and thank you so much for some great insights. I think we're seeing a move to protect our margins, so reducing our inventory and looking for better prices from suppliers overseas, whilst at the same time, as you just said, where there's plenty of pressures overseas that could blow that out of the water. So we need to balance our operational risk against our margin risk. It's a precautionary tale. Thank you so much. I would encourage everyone that's listening to tune into the webinar and see the pretty graphs and your pretty face rather than just listening to your wise words. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, James, and thanks everyone for having me. Hope you have a great time.
Well, that's it for another episode of Supply Circles. Thanks again to everyone for listening, and thank you for your feedback. It's greatly appreciated. If you have any feedback on today's interview with Dr. Jeff Wilson or ideas for the show, or just want to give me some feedback, hit me up at james.scotland@aigroup.com.au or head over to my LinkedIn page. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back in a fortnight with more business improvement insights into the keys to building sustainable supply chains. Thanks for joining me. This is Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland. Bye for now.